Chapter 8. The Forest Owls. Timber was a slightly backwater country. Everything seemed to move slower there. Even Balam, for all that it was a relaxing port town, seemed to move faster than Timber. Timber was more of a way station than anything anyway. It was a stop between train stops. As Squall stepped from his train and looked around, he was rather unimpressed. There was just train tracks, stone buildings, and bored-looking people going about their daily lives. It looked nothing like the political hotbed Zell had promised. Well, he supposed that there could be anything lurking underneath. Pretty, Selfie beamed, just a step behind him. She stood up on her toes, shading her eyes so she could get a better look at the town.
Hey, you can see the forests from here.
Yeah, you sure can.
The three seeds looked over to see a rather nondescript man standing up from a crouch halfway up the stairs. He had a blue beanie cap pulled down over his eyes. Aside from his yellow vest, he really sort of blended in with the scenery.
It's a shame though,
he sighed sadly, looking off towards the forests as well.
The forests of Timber sure have changed.
Selfie and Zell smiled at him, leaving Squall to reply.
But the owls are still around. Welcome to Timber, sir.
The young man bowed his head, turning to face them. When he did so, he flinched back. Because Squall, standing in front, looked far too menacing. So much so that he barely noticed the other two behind him. Squall stared at him expectantly, his eyes dark and cold. The man shivered and rather wished he hadn't said the password.
See, come this way, sir.
Squall and the others followed him as he led them down and across the next set of train tracks. He motioned for them to stop as he beckoned someone forward. A train car with a single locomotive drove around at his gesture. It was as bright yellow as his vest, and Squall lifted an eyebrow at it. It was the most obvious base he had ever seen before, and he came from a glorious, rich garden that made no attempts to hide.
Okay, keep comin',
the nondescript man said.
Ah. No, too far. Look out.
Squall made a face as the train slammed on its brakes. The brakes squealed unpleasantly against the wheels as the train came to a halt barely a foot from the nondescript man. The door opened and another guy came running out. He was shorter than the nondescript one, but he had a stronger build.
What are you doing?
He yelled at him, annoyed.
How many times do I have to tell you not to stand in front of the train?
He paused as he caught sight of Squall and the others. Selfie and Zell were standing back behind Squall, making it clear that he was the leader in the situation. Clearing his throat, the second guy walked closer to the other nonchalantly. Or what he thought was nonchalantly. It really wasn't at all.
Hey, so? That them?
He asked his friend on what he thought was a whisper. It wasn't either. The first one nodded, looking at Squall hesitantly.
They said the right password, sir, but, that one there looks kind of scary. Ugh. Who cares?
The second one pushed him back.
Just call em over here. We're paying em a fortune, we can't have em leave now, no matter how scary they look.
The first man smiled at them then, still a bit uncomfortable.
Please follow me, sir.
Zell and Selfie shared a look as Squall crossed his arms.
Hey, come on,
the second one waved them forward towards the door of the train.
Please excuse him. This way. Right through here.
Seed was all about following orders. Squall led the others over to the train and stepped inside just behind the first man. Selfie was giggling to herself as she looked around the inside of yet another train, though this one wasn't nearly so fine as the first. Zell came in last right behind the first man, who closed the door behind them all. The train lurched as it pulled away from the station.
"So, you guys are seeds?"
the second man asked eagerly, looking at them.
"I'm the squad leader, Squall,"
he nodded once. Gesturing to them in turn, he continued,
"This is Zell, and Selfie." "Nice to meet ya,"
the man gave a careless two-fingered salute from the forehead.
"I'm Zone, the leader of the Forest Owls."
He stepped forward, his hand out like he expected Squall to shake it. Squall ignored it completely and just nodded in greeting. Zone looked uncomfortable and moved on to Selfie instead. She happily shook his hand. Beside her, Zell wiped off his glove in preparation to shake his hand as well. Zone ignored him accidentally. Zell deflated and turned away, irritated. Squall nodded again, considering the introductions over with. This was the guy he answered to then. It was time to get to work.
"So, let's get on with it. What do we do?"
"Whoa," the leader laughed in surprise.
"Just take it easy. Here, let me introduce you. You've already met Watts. So, I guess it's just our princess then." "It's the princess nap time, sir,"
Watts said happily.
"Aw, man,"
Zone deflated before turning to the seeds.
"Hey, Squall, sorry, but could you go get the princess? She's in the last room up those stairs. Some of our other guys are in the room just before it. They can show you if you need 'em to."
Squall's frown deepened as he felt genuinely insulted.
"Were we hired to run errands?"
Zone and Watts both froze at the icy chill in his voice. Neither of them said anything.
"Well,"
he prompted.
"Are you angry?"
Zone stuttered as though surprised. They weren't gophers. They were SEAD. Special Forces. They hadn't gone through years of training and buckets of blood and sweat to be fetch boys.
"Seriously?"
Zell whispered behind his back.
"You tell 'em, Squall,"
Selfie agreed, frowning. Neither Zone nor Watts heard because, unlike them, they knew how to whisper. Glaring back at the leader, he said precisely,
"This is the last time for this kinda thing."
Suddenly groaning in pain, Zone, the self-proclaimed leader, turned and ran to a corner. He bent over, clutching at his stomach like it was aching. Since he wasn't looking, Squall felt safe rolling his eyes at him. Was he for real? Now filled with apprehension at the princess these two spoke of, Squall turned and started up the stairs. Zell and Selfie stayed back, talking to each other quietly. Squall didn't really pay attention to what they said, but they didn't sound any more complimentary than his own thoughts. The instructions were incredibly easy to follow. It was impossible to get lost in a straight line. Squall passed the second room that held 3 men all hunched over a something spilling out circuitry. He didn't care to look further. The last door on the train was already open. As he came closer, he could see inside. It wasn't plain gray metal like the rest of the train. Someone had actually taken the time to paper the walls in that room, and they had chosen a dusty, rosy pink. He had really been hoping that when they said princess, they had been kidding. The pink paper turned into pink carpeting with dark hardwood paneling. There was a vanity in the room that held makeup and perfume. A large, cozy bed was placed in one corner. Though there was a pink blanket to go with it, the occupant had kicked it off. Squall stilled just inside the door. That heart-shaped face. That black hair with golden highlights. The subtle curves of a body and bare arms that bore no signs of ever having been in a battle. It was her. The girl from the party. The train started coming into a turn and the motion of the train rolled her over in her bed. Which, in turn, roused her from sleep. She blinked sleepily and Squall found himself staring into those same brown eyes that he thought he had purged from his mind. The eyes he had really been hoping he would never see again. She smiled sleepily upon seeing him, then greeted him like he was expected.
"Hey."
She sat up and blinked a few times and he could see the fog of sleep lift from her eyes. As it did so, a recognition of reality came into her face.
"You're..."
she gasped, lowering her leg from the bed.
"You know, from the party."
Squall nodded once.
"So, does that mean..."
A grin started on her face.
"You're a seed?"
He stepped forward, all professional.
"I'm Squall, the squad leader. There's 2 others with me."
"Yes.
She jumped from her bed so quickly Squall was surprised.
"Seed is here."
He grounded himself just in time for her to throw herself at him. Her arms went around his neck and he automatically spun her around to release her momentum. She was laughing in his ear, squeezing him tightly. Squall pulled her arms off of his neck so he could step back away from her. It didn't diminish her excitement in the least.
"Take it easy,"
he said, trying to keep her from jumping him a second time. Because now he knew what her body felt like pressed so tightly against his. Her breasts pushed into his chest, her arms around his neck. The subtle, flowery scent of her perfume that clung to her hair. It was wrapping around his senses now. Suddenly, that was all he could think about. He needed to keep himself calm and maintain his professionalism.
"It's just that,"
she nearly twirled right there.
"I'm so happy. I've been sending requests to Garden for seed support forever, but nothing. I'm so glad I spoke to Sid directly."
Oh, Squall suddenly understood. And why was he happy to hear it was his elderly, fatherly headmaster she had been seeking?
"So you were looking for the headmaster at the party?" "Well, not exactly,"
she laughed.
"Do you know someone named Cypher?"
Did he know Cypher?
"Yeah,"
Squall said neutrally. She beamed.
"He was supposed to introduce me to Sid at the party, but he didn't show up for some reason. So I just found him myself. Sid is such a nice man. I really didn't think Sid would actually come out to help a measly little group like ours, even if I asked personally. But after I explained our situation to him, Sid gave the go-ahead right away."
Squall wasn't surprised at all. The garden faculty usually fielded seed requests. Few actually brought up the matter directly with the headmaster. Probably because the faculty forbade it. They knew the headmaster well. They knew he was a nice man. He would never be able to say no to a plea given right to his face. No wonder Squall had come out here despite everything. Laughing happily, she made her way over to her vanity.
"Now that you guys are here, we'll be able to carry out all kinds of plans. This is so great."
Squall watched as she moved the makeup and perfume out of the way. From within the desk of the vanity, she pulled out a small PDA and, to his surprise, a weapon. Looking at her now, Squall was beginning to doubt very much that Zone was the leader around here no matter what he claimed. This girl had gone to garden. She had been the one requesting seed both in writing and in person. They called her princess and clearly deferred to her. Just by the way she acted and moved, he didn't see her in the chain of command. Zone might be the leader, but she was the one in charge. He watched as she strapped the weapon onto her arm, using her blue cloth bracers as a cushion so it didn't touch her bare skin. It was a ranged weapon that folded up into the long, thin device. She never had to hold it. Accounting for her lack of calluses. He still didn't believe she had ever been in battle though. Nor was she battle-trained. If she had been, there was no way she would have kept her weapon tucked away out of sight and in a difficult position to get hold of. She was his boss, he realized a little too late. She had been looking for Cypher at the party. It didn't matter that she was cute or that he could still feel her body in his arms, he had to keep his distance from her. He definitely didn't want the added complication a girl like her would bring into his life. And there was no way she wouldn't bring complication. She oozed difficulty.
"Hey,"
he said, catching her attention.
"Yes."
She turned, smiling. He pointed over his shoulder.
"I'm going back to the others." "Okay, let's go."
She beamed, stepping closer to him. She hesitated, biting her lip.
Squall. Is he here?"
He blinked at her, not understanding.
"Cypher,"
she clarified, laughing nervously. Yeah, there was definitely something between them. Hein, of course. The first girl he had ever been seriously interested in, and she was already taken. By Cypher of all people. Well, at least that interest was completely private. No one had known and no one need ever know.
"No,"
he said, wondering how to phrase himself gently.
"Cypher isn't a member of Seed." "Oh."
To his surprise, she looked surprised. Her "oh" wasn't one of disappointment, it was like he had said something to her that went against all her beliefs. She stepped past him, thinking about that. She hit the door and turned at the last moment. The light from the hallway framed her like a halo, and Squall felt something like a punch to his gut.
"Oh, yeah,"
she laughed at herself like she was silly for forgetting.
"My name's Rinoa."
She reached out and, before Squall realized what he was doing, he was shaking her hand. Even through his glove, he could feel how soft her skin was.
"Very pleased to meet you, Squall,"
she said. He rather liked the way his name rolled off her tongue and the way she smiled at him when she said it. She stepped away slightly, holding her arms behind her back, and smiled at him.
"Seed members dance quite well, don't they?"
Hein. He had made a complete fool of himself in front of her. That was fine before she was his client and boss. He cleared his throat surreptitiously, standing straighter.
"Approach your target inconspicuously at a dance party. There may be missions requiring this sort of subterfuge. It's expected of Seed to learn various skills."
Yeah, that sounded legit and overly complicated.
"Oh."
Rinoa's face fell with her shoulders.
"So it's work-related. That's too bad."
Squall frowned at her, but before he could ask what that meant, he heard the clicking of claws against metal that quickly turned to the thud of paws on carpet. Rinoa turned and smiled at the dog that had come into her room. It stared at Squall. Squall stared at it. There was an instant dislike.
"Here, let me introduce you,"
Rinoa said, kneeling to pet the pooch's head.
"This is my partner Angelo. Angelo is really smart. He knows how to fetch and track and attack and seek help. And he knows a whole library of tricks." He's a lot of fun.
Squall nodded.
Dogs are very useful.
Rinoa seemed surprised to hear him say so.
You think? Absolutely. They have superior senses of hearing and smell. In the field, they can prove to be the difference between life and death by acting as an early warning system of enemies approaching. You could try to use magic or technology to achieve the same effect, but there's really no substitute for eons of evolution and survival.
Rinoa was smiling at him in that way again. That way that made his gut clench.
You know, no one has ever actually agreed with me. They all just think I want to keep my pet around.
Squall looked over Angelo critically. The dog did the same.
He's got a good form. His fur is well groomed. You take good care of him. But he's also muscular, and see the way his ears twitch? He's listening. That's the sign of a good watchdog. Don't forget that he's smart,
she smiled, standing up. Squall nodded, agreeing with her.
The best ones are.
Rinoa looked down towards her dog, still smiling.
I have some important work to do now. Be good, Angelo. Come on, Squall.
She stepped from the room, leaving Squall and Angelo to glare at each other.
What?
Squall asked him, crossing his arms. Angelo bared his teeth, growling slightly.
Yeah? Well, get used to it.
Still eyeing each other, Squall stepped from the room, following after Rinoa. She was waiting for him at the top of the steps. She gave him that adorable smile as he caught up, and he really rather wished she would stop. He went down the steps ahead of her and pointed to his squad mates.
This is Cell, and Selfie. Hi, everyone,
Rinoa beamed as the two of them stood up. She wouldn't have marked either of them as battle-hardened warriors, especially not the tiny girl in yellow, but who was she to say what a person could or couldn't do?
This way,
she waved them forward, following Zone and Watts into a small room. It had a toy train track in it. What was with timber and trains? There were some aspects of people that Squall would just never understand.
Just stand anywhere you want,
Zone said, throwing out his arms. It took Squall a second to realize that this was a debriefing room. There was a picture of the map system of Timber and what looked like the president of Galbadia and nothing else. Nothing else at all in the entire room besides a single crate by the door. Squall said nothing as he, Zell, and Selfie went to stand near the back. Selfie immediately took up her post looking out the window. Zell stared at the picture on the cork board. Squall turned back to Rinoa and the others to await his assignment.
This here is a full-scale operation,
Zone announced grandly.
Our resistance, the Forest Owls, will be forever known in the pages of Timber's independence. Exciting, hey?
Not nearly.
It all started when we got a hold of top-secret info from Galbadia,
he whispered for dramatic effect.
I got the info, sir.
Watts interjected eagerly. Like a puppy.
There's a VIP from Galbadia coming to Timber. Super VIP. The guy's name?
Zone paused for dramatic effect.
Is Vinzer Delling. Our archenemy, the president of Galbadia.
Had he been watching the same old movies Cypher had?
Vinzer Delling is a scoundrel.
Watts chirped in again.
He's a dictator, not a president. Not even popular in Galbadia, sir.
Well, that was debatable, but let the angry resistance members believe what they wanted. Rinoa spoke up this time, calmer than the boys.
President Delling is taking a private train from the Galbadian capital. Our plan,
Zone picked up as Selfie turned from the window, is to
blow it to smithereens with a rocket launcher.
She yelled loudly and excitedly.
Ah!
Zone fell back in surprise. Well, it was a messy plan, but Squall couldn't deny that it would get the job done.
Not quite,
Zone laughed nervously.
So get to the point,
Zell said, turning from the cork board.
Just tell us what to do. Shall we begin?
Rinoa asked, gesturing towards the train set. Wait, it had a purpose?
This model holds both our train and the President's locomotive. That yellow train up there is our base connected to the dummy car. The dummy car is an exact replica of the President's car. This is their train here. The locomotive, the first escort, the President's car, and the second escort in that order. Our ultimate goal is to seize the President in his car using our base. That means we'll have to switch our dummy car with their President's car. We're going to be using the 2 switch points leading up to Timber to carry out the operation. I've distilled it down into 7 steps. So listen up.
Rinoa hit a button on the side of the tracks which sent the little train minis into motion.
First we'll get on the roof of the second escort by jumping from the roof of our dummy car.
We? What was this we?
The second escort car is equipped with sensors, sir,
Watts told them.
I'll tell you about those in a second.
Rinoa waved the information away. Squall would rather have it now, but it wasn't his debriefing.
Second step, we sneak across the sensors. Third step, we sneak across the President's car. He doesn't like having sensors or guards, so you don't need to worry about that one. Delling hates his guards, the constant security of the sensors,
Zone explained.
He makes sure to keep them well away from him. All the better for us. Fourth,
Rinoa continued,
the first big step. We uncouple the first escort car from the dummy car. We have to complete the uncoupling before the first switch point. If we don't... Boom.
Selfie filled in easily.
Game over. Right. Yeah,
Rinoa nodded, frowning with worry.
We'll have to move fast. I'll tell you how to uncouple the cars in a second. Step 5, when the cars are uncoupled, our car and the dummy car come in and sandwich between the first escort and the dummy car. Our trains will be linked. This is the most dangerous part of the operation, so we need to minimize the time spent on this step as much as possible, okay? Step 6, we uncouple the second escort and first escort again. We'll need to detach ourselves from their train on both ends. And that leads us to step 7, and my personal favorite step, we escape with our base and the President's car leaving behind our dummy.
Squall said nothing as his eyes moved over the board, taking in the steps of the simulation. Personally, he felt it was rather overcomplicated and needlessly dangerous. It wasn't his mission though, and it wasn't his place to question.
If all goes well,
Rinoa continued,
we should be able to escape without them suspecting a thing. After that, we return to our base and prepare to confront Delling. We have exactly 5 minutes to complete all 7 steps. If we fail, our train will collide with theirs at the switch point and it will all be over. Like, massive fireball over. Don't forget that. 5 minutes.
Zell frowned. He wasn't sure about the scale on the train set.
You sure that's enough? According to the simulation we've run,
Zone said,
it should only take 3 minutes to complete the operation. Piece of cake for seeds, right? Of course.
Selfie laughed, getting excited at the prospect of the danger.
Too easy.
Squall said nothing as he continued observing the tracks.
All right, Watts has all the information on the sensors. Watts? The two guards on the train will have a sound sensor and a temperature sensor,
he said immediately and quickly. Like he was eager to get out as many words in a minute as possible.
Any sound will trigger the sound sensor that the lower officer carries. The temperature sensor will go off if you remain in one place for too long. The senior officer carries that one. The range of the sensors is pretty slim, so you shouldn't have to worry too much. Next,
Rinoa took over again,
uncoupling the cars. Question.
Selfie raised her hand.
How can you uncouple cars from a moving train? You can't normally. It's not so easy as when it's still. We have to do it indirectly. We have to tamper with the control system that manages the coupling,
Zone said knowledgeably.
If we temporarily disable the circuit for the connection, the car will uncouple automatically as the system reboots. To disable the circuit, you need to be able to enter the emergency override codes into the panel on the side of the car. And we have the codes.
Watts yelped eagerly.
Rinoa has them, sir.
Well, that explained the we, Squall thought as he looked back to her. She was grinning proudly.
I'll be in charge of relaying the codes to Squall. Squall, you'll slide down on the side of the train using a cable and enter the codes into the system. It's going to be hard to hear me over the sound of the train moving as we'll be so far apart, so I've come up with some hand signs for each of the 4 number possibilities on the keypad. 1 is this,
she closed her hand into a fist.
2 is this.
She crossed her first 2 fingers.
3 is this,
she held up her flat palm.
And 4 is this.
She split her 4 fingers into a V.
So if the code is say, 3124, I'll do this.
She flashed her fingers precisely and carefully through each of the 4 hand signals she had given him.
Also, you have to be quick. You'll only have 5 seconds to enter the emergency override codes. If you take too long, the system will shut you out and we'll have missed our chance. And we have to do it all before the switch point.
She grinned, cocking her hip out at Squall with a challenging grin. That same grin that had gotten him to dance at a party he hadn't wanted to be at.
Ready to practice? Make sure you have all the hand signals.
Squall nodded once.
Confident,
she laughed approvingly.
I like it. Okay, tough guy.
She gave him 4 hand signs without a word passing through her lips. Squall listed them off flawlessly. She grinned and gave him a second set. He didn't hesitate. She did it a 3rd time and Squall was already answering her before she finished.
Absolutely perfect, she admired. You know, I heard Seed was good, but I have to say that I'm really impressed with how quickly you pick things up.
It was a simple substitution cipher. It was the kind of puzzle that underclassmen did for fun. It wasn't anything impressive. It wasn't even particularly long. They hadn't even used all 10 possible digits. Why was she impressed with that simple thing?
Don't forget the time limit, of course. I'm going to do my part to make sure everything goes as fast as possible. So look alive, guys. That's all. Hey, another question.
Selfie raised her hand a little more sedately this time. She used it to point at the track.
This model is nice and all, but the president's car looks kinda shabby. Why is that?
Watts, once again, jumped in happily.
Rinoa made it. That's why. We bought everything else at the gift shop in town. Oh,
Zell snickered.
I thought some kid made it. The paint job sucks too.
Yeah, it kind of did.
Oh, shut up.
Rinoa snapped, her cheeks blazing red.
I made it look like that on purpose. It represents my hatred towards Deling. Hatred, eh?
Zell continued to snicker disbelievingly.
Yeah, right. It is one of the ugliest things that I've ever seen in my life,
Selfie admired.
You must really hate him.
Squall said nothing.
Are you guys finished?
She stomped her foot in anger. And hein if that wasn't adorable.
Enough about the model. Can we get on with it now? Do you understand everything?
Yes, Squall said immediately. Overly complicated, but still relatively simple. It shouldn't be that major of a problem.
Great. Zone, Watts, do either of you want to come up to the roof and help?
Their reaction was instantaneous. Zone jerked back like she had hit him.
Gathering information is my specialty, sir.
Watts yelled quickly as he was backing out the room. Zone meanwhile was howling in pain as he squatted in the corner again, grabbing at his stomach, crying about it hurting. Rinoa had her hands on her hips, shaking her head at them. It was a move that Squall was inclined to agree with. However, they weren't the first to hire Seed to do the things that they were too scared to attempt. Squall was pretty sure that was the bulk of Seed clientele actually.
I guess that leaves just us,
she smiled back at the Seeds.
We should be coming up on the zone soon, so let's get ready on the rooftop. You shouldn't need to bring your weapons. They'll probably only slow you down up there. You can leave them in here if you want. No one is going to mess with them, I promise.
Then Rinoa was forced to stand there with wide eyes as the three of them disarmed themselves. It wasn't just as simple as Squall pulling his blade from his waist or Selfie setting down her nunchaku next to it. The three of them were armed to the teeth. Squall set down his pouches of ammo, cleaning kit, and the belt with the extra ammo and Odin capsules. Zell had managed to stuff his pockets with what looked like every Odin capsule ever invented, along with spare gloves and the raw materials to make another pair. Selfie couldn't stop pulling bombs hidden about her person and placing them down. Rinoa started frowning at the growing pile.
You know, you didn't have to stuck enough to win an entire war all by yourselves.
Squall grinned to himself.
What do you mean? We packed light for this trip. Oh,
Rinoa grinned.
That's a good one.
Selfie was frowning at her pile.
I don't know. I still feel like I should have packed my secondary weapons. Guns may not be as useful as they used to be, but they can still do some damage. Especially my RPG launcher. I just got new sights for it. Selfie,
Squall gave her a cool look.
When would you ever need an RPG? When would you not?
She returned like he was ridiculous.
Oh, hein, you weren't kidding,
Rinoa said, her lips numb. How was it that she and this group of people were the same age and species?
We're ready,
Squall nodded to her, turning from their pile of stuff.
Yeah.
Rinoa shook her head, pointing over her shoulder.
The hatch to the roof is this way. Watts should have already gotten it open. Follow me.
Squall was right behind her as she stepped from the room. Watts was standing by the ladder that would lead to the top. He smiled at them.
Have you seen the dummy of the president, sir? It's like a piece of art. Whatever,
Squall said, looking up at the hatch. Pretty windy.
Rinoa, is the entry panel a touch screen? I think so. I'm pretty sure.
Without another word, Squall reached up and pulled his jacket off with a quick jerk. Rinoa blinked at him as he pulled a silver ring with a monster engraving from his hand. His gloves, which would make it harder to press buttons, followed after it. He put those in the pocket and passed it off to Watts.
Put it with my stuff for when I get back,
he ordered, reaching out for the ladder. Rinoa blinked as he put his bare hands on the rungs and started climbing. His undershirt was sleeveless, offering her a view of what his uniform and then jacket had hidden from her view before. Though it wasn't obvious with his large clothing, Squall was muscular. Rinoa's eyes tracked the movement of those muscles as he climbed up to the top. She had felt those arms around her and couldn't remember those muscles before. Maybe she just hadn't been paying attention. She was very focused now. She thought back to that moment that she had jumped around his neck earlier. Now, in thinking about it, she realized that he had carefully guided her back to the ground. He hadn't just dropped her or let her fall on her own. Rinoa really hadn't considered herself an arm type of girl before, but Squall had a nice pair. She wondered what it would be like to wrap her hands around his biceps and feel him flex them. She bet he was taut like spun steel under that battle-hardened skin. His boots disappeared over the rim of the hatch and Rinoa quickly jumped in front of Selfie to climb up after him. She moved familiarly up the ladder and somehow was surprised to see Squall crouched there at the edge. He reached down as she got close and grabbed her hand to help her up. His hands were just as rough as she remembered, yet still held her hand just as carefully. The wind of the moving train whipped her hair about her face as she climbed up over the lip of the hatch and crouched down before him. At least until he moved in front of her and used his body to break the wind from hitting her so directly. He didn't make a big deal about it. It didn't even look like he thought about doing it. Just like he didn't appear to think about reaching out to hold onto her waist so she didn't slip and fall while waiting for the others to climb up. He just did it. Zell climbed up last, shutting the hatch behind him. Rinoa nodded and yelled out over the billowing of the wind around her face, pointing for emphasis.
Squall, over there. We'll catch up to the second escort soon. It's going to be a bit of a big jump from our car to theirs, so give yourself some room to run.
Squall started to jog, at a crouch, to the other side of the train. He kept himself in front of her so she wouldn't be in the wind too much. Rinoa stayed behind him, grinning at the taste of her upcoming victory. Seed was here, how could everything not be perfect? President Deliang's train was cruising along the tracks straight from Galbadia. Their train had zoomed out here from Timber just to catch up with them. The parallel train tracks were rather close. Still, the gap was rather daunting from up here than it had been on the ground when she and Zone had initially mapped out the plan. They zoomed past the first landmark.
All right,
she yelled out to her seeds.
From this moment, we have exactly 5 minutes to complete the operation. Use every second you have. Squall.
On command, he took his stance. His eyes gauged the distance between the two trains. As their base came in closer, he took off. It wasn't such a great distance. The hardest part was landing. He hit hard against the second escort and paused, waiting for some sign he had been spotted. When none came, he turned back and waved the rest of them forward. Selfie eagerly jumped after him, because of course she did. She landed perfectly, like she might have been jumping trains all her life. She was laughed as she ran past Squall and crouched behind him. Zell came next. He wasn't nearly so graceful, but he landed without issue.
Eyes on the guards,
Squall yelled at them over the wind.
Dibs on blue.
Zell yelled, running towards the edge.
Hey, no fair.
Selfie ran after him. Squall turned back just as Rinoa was setting up her jump. He waited as she timed it out, biting her bottom lip in concentration. He really hoped she didn't do that on the jump. If she landed wrong, she might very well bite it off. He didn't get a chance to tell her so. She sprinted after him and leapt with a cry of effort. Squall watched her form as she flew, 1 foot forward through the air. It was graceful. Not like a warrior but like someone who had taken dance lessons in their life. She didn't land perfectly either. She slipped as she hit the roof and fell at his feet. Squall didn't attempt to catch her nor haul her up again. She grunted in pain but sat up on her own.
All right?
He asked. She nodded.
Everything's good. Keep going.
Why hadn't he caught her, she wondered to herself. Surely he should have tried. Any other guy would have tried if only to get their arms around her. He didn't even flinch as she fell. But those eyes of his, those deep, quiet eyes had watched her. Rinoa had the sneaking feeling that, despite not having moved, that he had been ready to catch her. If she had needed it. He had let her make the jump on her own but hadn't refused giving his assistance. It was an equal treatment that she hadn't expected from someone seed-trained. Her experience with Cypher told her that he should have offered to carry her across himself. Squall turned back when Rinoa didn't follow him.
Problem?
He asked loudly over the wind.
No,
she shook her head, smiling.
Come on. We have to get across the president's car.
Zell and Selfie gave the go-ahead with their guards, allowing Squall and Rinoa to run across. The jump between cars was much easier, Rinoa didn't even hesitate. After all, she had just jumped between trains. What was this little gap? The president's car wasn't nearly as lavishly decorated as the private seat compartment in their train out of Balam. Vinzer Delling didn't know that, of course. He believed that his car with the seating for 1, maybe 2 people, was quite luxurious. Certainly no one had skimped on the materials to create the car. The Galbadian soldier who walked in from the second escort spotted his president exactly where he had been before. Seated, unmoving, in his spot and staring out of the window. There was a grumpy scowl on his face that, honestly, wasn't all that uncharacteristic. When he wasn't in the public eye, Delling tended not to really smile at all.
Sir, everything is in order, sir.
The soldier reported dutifully. Delling sighed, turning to him.
You again?
It was said that President Delling had been handsome in his youth. No one had pictures from that time though, so if it were true it had long ago lost the battle to time. Vinzer Delling hadn't aged well. His skin was like paper, sagging from too much fine food, and wrinkled from years of stress in politics. His salt and pepper was far more salt than pepper and his hands had started developing liver spots. Despite that though, his eyes were as sharp as ever.
That's 27 times now, the president said, his voice dull but annoyed. How many more times do you plan to disturb me with that meaningless report? Sir, I'm sorry, sir,
the soldier said, continuing to salute him. They stared at each other for a second.
But is it my duty, sir?
President Delling sighed, his head dropping.
It's hard to believe that anyone would put up with this nonsense. I guess it's none of my business. Dismissed.
The soldier frowned but didn't voice his confusion. He was far too attached to his livelihood to want to try and question the president.
Sir, yes, sir.
He finished his salute. As he turned to return to his car, he was glad for his mask to hide his heartbroken expression. And just like that, there went his next paycheck. How was he supposed to propose now? He was going to have to put it off again. Squall and Rinoa crouched down at the back end of the first escort. Zell and Selfie were behind them again. Selfie appeared to be having the time of her life.
We're going to uncouple this first,
Rinoa was saying, pointing down the side of the car where the access panel would be.
There should be 2 guards on this car, too. Selfie, Zell, you guys keep an eye on them. Let us know early if they start making their way over. Dibs on blue. Dibs on dang it.
Selfie glared at the laughing Zell. The 2 of them ran off. Due to the sensor system, Zell could, and had to, stay in exactly one spot to watch his guard. Selfie would need to keep moving.
Squall, get the cable ready,
Rinoa ordered. He was already moving. The circular base for the cable was usually made for construction work and it held on fast and tight when he flipped the switch on the electromagnet. Squall tested the strength of the cable by tugging on it and was satisfied. He nodded to Rinoa.
This panel has 3 override codes. You have exactly 5 seconds to enter each code, so you can't come up while entering them. The panel should open with a touch. We have about 4 minutes left. Good luck, Squall.
Squall looked over and got a nod from Zell and a thumbs up from Selfie. Clutching the cable in one hand, Squall shimmied quickly down the side of the train. Rinoa had to admit, at least to herself, that she hadn't actually been expecting him to do it. She knew Seed would follow any order and that no task was too much for them. Everyone knew that. Still, it was somehow shocking to see someone her age willingly scale down the side of a moving train. He put his feet up against the metal hull, balancing himself, but his body was still inches from the gravel ground, rushing past him so fast it was a blur. He didn't even blink. He just hit the touch panel and let it slide open. Immediately, it asked for the first system access code. He looked up at her expectantly. His arm, that well-muscled arm, was flexed like steel against the cable he had wrapped around his wrist and bicep. He didn't appear to be straining to hold up his own weight. His eyes were still quiet and calm, even in this situation. The scar on his face seemed brighter somehow in the sunlight. Rinoa had thought him attractive in the ballroom, wearing his dress uniform and dolled up. Looking at him now, she realized that was nothing. He was breathtaking in his element. Strong and controlled, like a carefully wound spring. Seemingly innocuous until the moment all that energy released. She desperately wanted to see him release it. She bet it was devastating. In the best way. Rinoa remembered almost too late that she was supposed to be giving him the codes she had spent the last few days memorizing. She lifted her hand and went through the first series of numbers. He stared at her, those eyes of his carefully tracking her movement. His fingers were swift on the keys. When he finished, he didn't look up to her. He gazed moved to where Zell and Selfie were on guard duty. She gave another thumbs up. Squall frowned at her because she was remaining perfectly still. Both of them were. He had something more pressing to deal with now. Back to the panel. Rinoa watched, pushing her hair behind her ears, as he moved deeper into the system. She forced herself to focus on the mission, not his arms, and was already repeating the next set of numbers. So when he looked up and nodded, she was ready. She signed the next 4 numbers expertly. Squall had them entered easily and moved past that wall to the next stage of the decoupling. They repeated the process once more, and by then Zell called out to yell that the blue was coming. Squall glared at him as he climbed deftly up the side of the train.
"Why aren't you quiet? And why aren't you moving?"
he demanded to know angrily of the 2 of them. Selfie laughed. Zell yelled back,
"Dude, the sensors are duds."
Squall frowned. "Seriously?"
"This way!"
Rinoa yelled, pulling on his arm. The 2 of them jumped quickly back across the cars to stand at the front of the president's car as the override codes clicked into effect. The cars uncoupled and the president's car started lagging as its momentum drained out. Rinoa moved up to stand in front of Squall so she could watch her plan unfold before her. Her hair was whipping back, hitting Squall along the neck and chest. He could smell her perfume even up here. She was going to be the death of him, he just knew it. It was a thing of beauty to watch the forest owls zooming in from the first switch point. They operated like a well-oiled machine as they first backed up into the president's car. The open knuckle of his car was waiting and the system, having rebooted, locked them together immediately. The base drove forward then and locked up with the locomotive.
"Perfect!"
Rinoa laughed loudly. Squall's hand at her shoulder was her only warning that she had started slipping off. He caught her before she fell, confirming her earlier suspicion. He was ready to catch her if she needed it. She smiled back at him, unable to believe how well this was going. The Galbadian soldier crept into the president's car again and bit his lip in nervousness. He didn't want to, the president wouldn't like it. But he had to, it was his job. He would lose just as much money from not telling him as he would for telling him. And not telling him would get him in trouble with his CO, which would be worse for him in the long run.
"Yes, sir,"
he took a fortifying breath.
"Everything is in order, sir."
He winced in place, waiting for the verbal blow to fall. The demerit, the pay doc. The room remained silent and he dared open his eyes under the helmet. President Delling wasn't angry. He didn't appear to have even moved. Oh. He was reading the Galbadian Gazette. Where had he gotten a newspaper? Before he could make his escape, considering himself lucky to have the chance to flee with no further problems, his CO came running into the room.
"What?"
he asked angrily. He did everything angrily.
"Is there a problem?"
President Delling chose that moment to speak up.
"I'm in a bad mood right now. If there is nothing in particular, I order you to leave immediately."
Both soldiers jumped in fear.
"SS sir, aye. Yes sir."
The senior officer stuttered, saluting. Immediately, he turned to begin yelling at whoever was nearest to him to make it seem like he was doing his job.
"You! Don't just stand there! Get back to your station!" "Yes sir, yes sir."
And poof, there went another paycheck. 2 in one day. A new low. The senior officer turned and ran towards the next car so he could yell at the inferior officer there, and stopped when he ran into an unfamiliar room. He paused, confused, then turned and ran back inside the president's car.
What the heck?"
he said loudly. Was this the right train? It looked different. Shabbier. Maybe not. He didn't care that much. Deciding it wasn't worth it, he ran back to the second escort. The soldier under his command followed at a slower, more dejected pace. No ring. No more candlelight dinner. At this point, he was not only never going to get married but his girl might actually leave him.
Okay, Squall. One last uncoupling then we're home free.
Rinoa yelled at him, pushing her hair from her face. She was wishing now that she had followed Squall's example and left her duster back inside with his jacket. It was billowing everywhere and weighing her down.
Zell and Selfie won't take as long on their end, she continued, pointing up where the two of them were uncoupling the base from the first escort. You sure you got this on your own? Let's get it over with,
Squall yelled back, placing the electromagnet and turning it on.
Since we just disabled the system, it's going to make you dance through more hoops. There's going to be a total 5 codes this time. We've got about 3 minutes left. Whenever you're ready.
Squall didn't wait for her to finish. He was already grappling down towards the panel. Rinoa watched him go with a long breath of tension. The panel slid open easily and Squall looked up expectantly. It was exactly the same as the first time. Only now Squall was in charge of looking over towards the guards himself. They appeared to be arguing over something. He hoped they kept at it for a while. And, knowing this military, they very well might. 3 codes in, Squall was moving quickly through the screens to the next code entry when the train began to take a turn. Squall's hand tightened on the cable as the angular momentum of the turn had his feet lifting off of the hull. Rinoa's cry had him looking up in time to see her falling over the side. Her hands caught on the very edge of the train and Squall's eyes darted towards the guards. They were yelling at each other now, far too wrapped up in whatever they were doing to look outside. But if one of them were to just glance over and notice the flash of blue. The train pulled out of the turn and Squall's boots slammed against the wall in time with Rinoa's body. Her feet were nearly even with his shoulders and he could see her scrambling to get a grip on the smooth metal body of the locomotive. His hand slammed forward on accident, hitting the button to the next screen. He had 5 seconds.
Rinoa, code. Wa. Now. 1232.
He almost didn't hear her over the train. He entered in the codes quickly and the screen beeped, allowing him to progress further into the system. He ignored the screen and reached up. He caught Rinoa's scrambling foot in one hand. She looked down in surprise but didn't question him as he let her use his limb as a footstool for climbing back up. He pushed at the last second, giving her more lift to make sure she landed. She wasn't ready for it. His push and her jump lifted her just a little too high. She slammed down against the train and the thud finally caught the attention of the arguing guards.
Squall.
She turned back quickly.
Stay back.
Squall looked over as the guards started moving closer. The red one was running, the blue was walking, but the blue was already closer. Squall wouldn't have time to climb back. They would see his body through the windows. He squatted down and pushed back with only his right foot. The force caused him to clear the hull of the train again. The single-sided push twisted him and his cable around in an arc. He spun his body with the turn and reached out with his hand. He grabbed onto the first handhold that hit his fingers and suddenly all of his weight slammed down onto the tips of his fingers. He bit back a cry as he resisted the painful urge to let go. His body weight was too much for only the tips of his fingers against sharp metal. Rinoa looked over from him and down at an angle through the window in the train. She could see the flash of color that was the guards' uniforms as they halted beside the door. Her eyes darted over the side to Squall. Those arms she had been admiring a few moments ago were now straining painfully to keep him out of the way. She looked back and prayed they'd move quicker. It seemed like forever. They dawdled around, arguing again likely over whatever made the sound. She bit her lip and clenched her teeth and hoped they were as careless as most other G-Army thugs. An eternity later, they moved away from the window. She let out a long breath, grabbing for her racing heart as she felt wound up like a bowstring.
Squall, let go!
She yelled out. She saw the cable swing around as he obeyed. She glanced down again to see him perched right back in place, looking up at her expectantly. He was sweating now, but his face was still calm. Her hands shaking, Rinoa signed to him the last set of codes. Below, Squall cursed to himself because the fingers he needed to type with were now bleeding. He curled them inwards and hit the buttons with his knuckles. The fifth code entered, he slid the panel shut again and tried not to use his injured hand to climb back up the train. Shiva let out a cure spell to ease the pain. He still hid his hand from Rinoa as he reached the top. She was grabbing for his other arm, trying to help him up as best as she could. And, as a matter of fact, his arm was taut like spun steel. She might as well have been pulling against a rock wall for all the help it did him.
Are you okay?
She asked, worried.
Keep moving,
he ordered, pushing her forward back onto the president's car. Rinoa shook her head and obeyed him, running across the trains. Squall joined her not even a moment later, taking a knee right behind her. Rinoa was breathing hard as the train rocked her backwards against Squall's chest when the cars disconnected. Still, it was done. There was nothing else for her to do but watch as, like a well-oiled machine, their base pulled away from the train. The switch, on a timer set up by the techies in the train, flipped it right back again. The locomotive for the president was already slowing in anticipation of reaching timber. The released dummy car and second escort caught up easily and the trains jostled as the knuckles hooked up. She barely got to see it though because they were speeding away on a curve away from them all. And here she was, standing on top of President Deliang's very own car. She let out a startled laugh. Then another.
We did it! We did it, Squall! Let's get inside,
he told her instead of celebrating. He pointing up to where Zell had opened the hatch on the base and was waving them towards him even as Selfie climbed down. Rinoa moved quickly in her excitement and almost jumped down the hatch. Squall, last down, followed at a sedate pace.
We did it!
Zone yelled as Rinoa reached him. They high-fived both hands in celebration.
I know!
She yelled back, laughing loudly. She could still feel the wind in her face, the exhilaration lighting up her blood. They had taken a huge risk and it had turned out even better than she could have asked for.
Hey, Squall, you okay?
Selfie's soft question had Rinoa turning to the seed leader as he awkwardly made his way down the ladder using only one hand. The other he was keeping elevated and away from his body so his blood ran down his arm and not onto the floor or his shirt.
Oh, Hein!
Squall! Rinoa raced back to him, the excitement draining quickly at seeing the large gash going in a line across the fingers he had been using to hold onto the train.
Your fingers! I'm fine,
he assured her calmly.
I need my stuff. I'll get it!
Selfie yelled happily, running back into the debriefing room while Zell climbed up to shut the hatch. The sudden lack of wind made the room entirely too silent.
Squall, I saw that evade,
Zell was laughing, nudging his arm.
That was pretty sweet. And that gash? That's got to be at least, what? 6 centimeters. I'd say closer to 8,
Squall said calmly, trying to eye the damage under his own blood.
If you put it all together. How can you be so calm about this? You're bleeding.
Rinoa gasped, trying to grab for his arm so she could see it for herself. Squall jerked the blood-stained limb from her reach easily.
You don't need to worry about me. We were successful in the mission objectives, that's all that matters. What?
Rinoa frowned at him. Surely he wasn't serious?
Squall, got your stuff.
Selfie came running back, her arms weighed down with Squall's jacket, gunblade, and gear. Using his clean hand, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his inventory. Rinoa couldn't stop herself, she gasped upon seeing it.
Is that what I think it is?
She whispered in awe as he touched the screen a few times. A single push of a button later and suddenly there was a first aid kit on the floor of the train just waiting for his use. Squall kneeled before it, setting his inventory down beside him. Rinoa crouched down next to him, reaching for the item with odd hands.
Squall, that's an inventory. I'm aware,
he said, opening the first aid kit. The bleeding had already stopped thanks to the cure spell, he just needed to clean it. And wrap it. He didn't want to get blood inside his gloves. Not even dried. It was so hard to get out.
I've never seen one of these before,
Rinoa whispered, lifting the object and holding it in her hands lovingly.
It had to cost a fortune. Is this standard seed gear? Nah, that's just Squall,
Zell said, looking at it as well.
He had to save up for years to get it, too. This is amazing,
Rinoa whispered, touching it lovingly.
And it's breakable,
Squall said pointedly, lifting it from her hands. He set it back down beside him, within easy reach.
Just let me finish cleaning up here. Right,
Rinoa nodded, sitting back to watch him. Squall's hand, was deft and quick as he used a sterile rag and alcohol to wipe away his blood. He had the bandages wrapped equally quickly and was pulling on his glove over that. He clenched his hand into a fist then, testing it.
Doesn't that hurt?
Rinoa asked, concerned.
No. I've got cure spells. I'm ready to go.
Squall was already standing. Rinoa got to her feet as well as he put his first aid kit into his inventory, then that into his jacket, then his jacket over his shoulders. His gun blade was already at his waist. Zell and Selfie were behind him, equally prepared. Rinoa couldn't help it, she stared at him as Zone, still in the throes of victory, beamed.
Finally,
he said, savoring the word.
We've waited so long for this encounter with VIII. That was perfect, sir. Amazing, sir. You're the best, sir.
Watts told Squall eagerly. Yip, yip, went the puppy.
Rinoa.
Zone called her name, breaking her trance.
What? Oh, right. You were flawless, Squall. Exactly what I wanted.
He nodded once, accepting her praise.
Now what? Now, I guess. We go in,
she said, her eyes moving towards the door between the cars. It was kind of hard to think that her goal was right behind two pieces of metal.
Zone? Watts? Leave the intelligence up to me, sir.
Watts was already saying, backing up into the debriefing room.
Ow, my stomach,
Zone cried, grabbing for his gut. Rinoa sighed, shaking her head.
All right, you three. Tell me when you're ready to go. As soon as you are, I'll begin some serious negotiations with the president.
Serious negotiations? Why did Squall not like the sound of that? He didn't know why they had to be equipped. It wasn't like President Delling was a fighter. He was an old politician. He probably couldn't even get himself out of bed in the mornings without a few test rolls to get things moving. Still, death came to the unprepared. Squall holstered his ammo as Selfie and Zell restocked their items and weapons on their persons. After Squall denied Zell the option to use his inventory, he turned to Rinoa and nodded to indicate that they were ready to continue. Rinoa tried to school her face into a serious expression as she opened the door. She was confident. She was going to do this. It was going to be easy. The words were running through as she stepped into the president's car. Admittedly, it was probably easier to be brave when she could feel Squall's weirdly cool presence behind her.
President Delling!
She called out confidently as she walked around to his side, injecting as much steel into her voice as she was able.
As long as you don't resist, you won't get hurt.
Yeah. That sounded good. President Delling didn't respond right away. He remained staring out the window. Then, as though he were on a delay, he turned to her. First his eyes, then slower his head. He didn't appear disturbed, annoyed, or even surprised. He looked disinterestedly curious.
And if I do resist?
He asked, his voice unaffected.
What would you do? Young lady.
Rinoa gasped and flinched back. That wasn't President Delling. He looked exactly like him, but Rinoa had seen the president up close on more than one occasion. Not only would he have recognized her, but she knew that wasn't his way of speaking.
What's wrong?
Squall asked, looking at her rather than the president.
Boo-hoo,
the not President Delling said as he lifted himself from the booth.
Too bad. I'm not the president. I'm what they call a body double.
Rinoa fell back a couple steps even as Squall stepped forward. His hand was already pulling his blade from his sheath as he regarded the not Delling carefully.
Ew,
Selfie moaned unhappily.
I hate body doubles.
Rinoa had heard of the president's body double. She didn't realize it would be so uncanny.
All these rumors about the many resistance groups in Timber,
the double continued, taking a couple staggered steps towards Rinoa.
You pass along a little false information, and they fall for it. How pathetic. Seemed like there are only amateurs around here.
Rinoa's eyes were wide, her face in shock.
AMA tours. Ah.
The president made a motion like he was stretching, but he was doing it in the wrong directions.
My butt hurts from all this sitting. Young lady.
The growling, somehow wet, sound that came from his throat was most definitely not the president. It didn't even sound human anymore. Rinoa was backing up quickly now. She didn't have to go far. She ran into Squall, who was already grabbing her arm, pushing her behind him. The not Delling didn't seem to notice or care. He was doing odd angle stretches again as his head rotated in a way that wasn't possible on a human neck.
Ah. So, what did you have in store for me? Had I resisted?
His wet growling was getting worse and Rinoa was making small noises of distress as Zell lifted his arms. Selfie was pulling back, more disgusted than afraid.
Why don't you tell me?
He asked as a strange blue drool started coming from his mouth. It dribbled down his chin and his rather nice suit.
Quite amusing though for being such amateurs.
He suddenly stopped. Like a video put on pause, he froze. Bubbles came from the blue drool in his mouth as its eyes burned with anger.
How dare you insult the president?
Not dealing charged directly at Rinoa. Directly at Squall, who was standing in front of Rinoa. He lifted the gun blade and caught the man's arm. It didn't slice off. It didn't even bleed. Squall's gun sank into his skin like he was poking at a blob. The blue drool was right in his face now and the stench of it was like decay.
Selfie, thunder!
Squall ordered, trying to push off the creature.
Thunder!
She obeyed immediately, throwing out her nunchaku. The blast of lightning from her weapon slammed into the body double's corpse and it flew towards the wall. It landed at an awkward angle. But he only ever seemed to exist at an awkward angle. It came up laughing, its expensive suit smoking.
You fell for it. Selfie, what's a body double?
Squall asked, remembering her earlier remark about disliking them.
It's disgusting.
She shivered.
It's an undead that can morph its flesh into other forms. Undead.
Rinoa repeated, backing up quickly against the train wall. Not because she was scared, she was trying to give them room. That's what she insisted to herself anyway.
Very well,
Squall nodded as the not dealing laughed at him through its teeth, blowing blue bubbles of viscous mucus as it did so.
Zell, light it up. Gladly.
Zell drew back his fists. They were already smoking in anticipation.
Ifrit. Fire.
He punched forward like he might be pounding his fist into someone's face. The blast of fire left his glove and slammed into President Dealing's body. The drool leaking down his designer suit caught the flame quite easily and the inferno engulfed him quickly. Not Dealing threw back his head and laughed as a thick, foul black smoke rose from his body. The three seats fell back, their faces screwing up in disgust. Rinoa nearly gagged, throwing up her hands to cover her nose and try to block the stench.
Amusing.
Not Dealing laughed as his skin started melting.
This is amusing.
Throwing back his head, he continued laughing as the flames burned away his suit. His skin melted into a thick, blue-black puddle at his feel. Squall stepped back, using his arm to cover his nose as the repulsive odor made his eyes water. Not Dealing was melting with the fire. No. He was reforming. The blue ooze was smothering the flames as even the memory of Deling was shed from the monster that unfolded itself from the president's old form. It was still dripping blue drool. But its red, gooey blood was now visible through the viscera that was dangling, globular, from its open gut. Claws tipped its legs and feet. Its left side was bloated and grotesque and in sharp relief to its right, skeleton-thin side. It looked like the skin of its neck had been melted in the fire into its chest and it wobbled even as it stood still. The stench got somehow more nauseating as the thing showed its true form.
What they?
Zell gasped, trying to resist the urge to vomit.
Cover your face.
Squall ordered to two of them. It looked like Selfie, who had made no attempts to do so, was starting to get dizzy to the point where she might pass out. From inside his jacket, Squall pulled the very same blood and alcohol-soaked rag he had just used to clean his hand. It was filthy, but at least the scent of his own blood and the sterilizing effects of the alcohol would block the stench of rot. Selfie's weapon-cleaning rag was ripped from her boot and tied over her face. Zell grabbed for his own shirt and ripped off a piece to cover his. It was quickly done, but effective. Which, when it came to Seed, was the most important thing. It didn't have to be pretty, it just had to work. Squall spared only single glance back at Rinoa. She had grabbed the long tail of her duster and was holding it up over her face. She was making sure to stand back and out of the way. So long as she remained there, Squall would only need to make sure that he didn't lead an attack from the undead not dealing in her direction. He rather wished she would leave altogether. She would be safer if she wasn't in here watching them fight. Undead monsters. A highly specialized class of monsters that represented the antithesis of life. They were rather rare to find, but all the more deadly because standard attacks didn't work on them. The mystery of Squall's blade merely sinking its body earlier made sudden sense. Fire was only the second best attack he had against him. The first was far more precious.
Shiva, give me cure on my gun,
he instructed her, as not dealing shambled closer.
Zell, Selfie. Restorative magic and items, or fire. Man,
Selfie frowned.
I hate wasting my cure spells on monsters. Hee hee.
Zell slammed his fists together, fire sparking away from his gauntlets.
Thank you, Ifrit.
They also had the advantage of speed. As the undead monster shambled around them, the seeds were circling him to surround him on all sides. It growled at them, specks of blue spittle flying as it did so. Zell moved first. 2 punches into the air sent twin fireballs flying. The monster's skin didn't so much melt this time as it burned and curdled. It roared and the smell of its breath penetrated even through their improvised masks. Squall lifted his gun and let off 3 quick, healing shots. Against a normal opponent, such a bullet would do absolutely no damage. Against the undead, it was like a bullet that released acid into its bloodstream. It screamed in pain as Squall's magic penetrated into its unbeating veins.
Siren, cure!
Selfie yelled, throwing the spell from her nunchaku. She didn't aim for the body of the monster as Squall would have. The spell fell at its feet. At the noxious puddle of blue-black goo surrounding it and keeping them at bay. The cure spell purified the goo and left behind clear water in its place. The move did no damage to the monster, but it did anger it. He roared at Selfie and started a lopsided charge towards her, its ugly blue, jagged claws reaching out for her. Selfie's movements were fluid and quick as she ducked under its grasp. One end of her nunchaku came up and smacked it in the face. Then she turned around and a second blow landed against its back as she slipped behind him.
Selfie, fall back!
Squall ordered. The tiny girl jumped onto the table the Not President had been sitting it out and out of the way. Squall lifted his blade and swung it out in a wide arc.
Blizzard!
He roared as he did so. The blast of Arctic air that was slung by his blade instantly froze the water Selfie had just purified. The monster's feet, standing in the shallow pool, froze in place as the crystals grabbed onto its skin. Ice would do no damage to a creature like him, but it would keep it still.
My turn, baby!
Zell jumped onto the ice and slid on his sneakers across the ice. His flaming fist slammed into the monster's forehead as he passed. The scent of burning, Rotting flesh got worse as Zell threw the creature to the floor. Squall's ice grabbed onto its back now and locked it against the carpeting. Its limbs scrambled, breaking the rather thin layer of ice. But he was still and trapped in place for just a moment.
Cure.
Selphie threw her spell directly at it this time. It roared in agony as the healing magic destroyed its dead flesh. Squall ran across the ice easily, like he was made to do so. One boot planted against the misshapen, engorged right knee and he launched himself into the air. Gravity brought him and the tip of his revolver down directly into the monster's heart. It roared, but the blade couldn't stop an already dead heart. Squall pulled the trigger and a blast of cool, healing energy blasted directly into its core. Black blood seeped away from a wound that began slowly falling open. Squall dropped back as the monster grabbed for its chest. Cure spells worked slowly. It was killing him but at an agonizing pace.
Cure.
Selphie yelled.
Cure.
Squall shot.
Cure.
Zell punched. The 3 healing spells hit the monster at the same time. The foul air cleared as though a spring breeze had just blown through the cabin. The blue ooze from its mouth purified to water as its heart beat once, just long enough to bleed and allow the undead thing to truly die. Its limbs flopped to the sides, its body still. The cure spells would continue to work on its corpse. It wouldn't bring him back to life, but it would rot it in reverse. The fluids in its body would turn to water and its flesh turn to soil. The undead was the antithesis of life, and when it rotted it became the basis of life.
Whoa!
Rinoa breathed as the sudden fresh air had her lowering the tail of her duster. It smelled like a greenhouse in here now. Squall ripped the rag from his face and took a breath of air that wasn't tainted by blood or alcohol.
Shall we?
Selphie laughed, collapsing her nunchaku and storing them back in her boots. She was laughing and practically skipping as she returned to the forest owl's base. Zell was right behind her, picking at the charred flesh on his gauntlets with a frown. Squall stepped past Rinoa, who was looking up at him with wide eyes. She following him quickly out of the president's car, looking back only once before the door shut behind her. Zone and Watts, who had heard the commotion from the other side, descended on them with a series of loud, worried questions. Squall fell back and let Rinoa step forward and explain what had happened to them. He had done his job here. Back in the debriefing room, Zone slumped forward in dejection. Watts had left the room halfway through Rinoa's explanation. So it was just them and the seeds.
Man,
he sighed.
I can't believe the president was a fake. All that work for nothing. I can't believe we fell for it,
Rinoa frowned, holding her arm across her chest.
So what do we do now?
Zone asked her, frowning. Her brow furrowed as she thought for a moment. Her eyes lifted to Squall.
Squall, what do you think?
His brow raised in surprise at her seeking his opinion, but he didn't hesitate to give it.
If Galbadia had a body double ready for resistance movements to act against, then it stands to reason that they expected something like this and are ready to retaliate. It won't take long for them to see the mimic you put on the dummy train. In which case, they'll be on the lookout for the president's real car. So we should hide it,
Rinoa nodded, agreeing.
Zone.
He thought for a moment.
Well, there's a train graveyard on the abandoned site of Timber where the government buildings used to be. No one ever goes there. We can stash the president's car there and hide out until Watts figures out what's going on. Do it then,
Rinoa nodded to him. Zone rushed from the room to go talk to the driver of the train. She turned with a smile to the seeds.
Sorry about this. You guys did excellent work. I really couldn't have asked for more.
Squall nodded, accepting her praise.
What do you want us to do now? Nothing.
She looked confused at the question.
Relax. At least until Watts can get more intel. It shouldn't take him long, he's really good.
Stand by, Squall said to his team, translating the order simply.
So, can we check things out around the train?
Selfie asked, beaming.
Sure, of course you can,
Rinoa smiled back.
Awesome.
Selfie ran, laughing from the room. Zell followed more sedately. Squall didn't ask where they were going. It was none of his business what they did on what was, essentially, free time. For a long moment, he and Rinoa stood in the debriefing room alone. She was giving him an unreadable look and he was doing his best to remain still and stoic under her gaze. After a minute, she gave him a soft smile before walking out herself. Squall let out a long breath and looked over to the closed window. Stand by. How boring. The train graveyard on the far side of Timber had originally been a sort of outdoor museum for historic train cars of timber. For that reason, the government buildings had been built nearby. After the Galbadian War, the entire area had been partially burned, totally destroyed, and gutted completely of people. The museum was now where old trains went to die. The forest owl base blended in well with the old cars. The president's car was buried deep in the graveyard and the seeds and the owls spent some time aging it with a combination of chemicals and fire so it wasn't identifiable. Afterwards, the forest owl base was driven to most remote, oldest part of the graveyard, and allowed to come to rest for the night. They would keep it there so no one would find it until Watts returned with new information. At that point, some of the owls went home. The 3 tech members all did. Zone and Rinoa stayed, as did the seeds. Zone slept in the debriefing room. Rinoa, of course, had her carefully decorated and furnished room. Rinoa asked where the seeds would be sleeping. Squall told her not to worry about it.
How can I not?
She asked, frowning at his response. Neither seed seemed to mind him speaking for them. Zell was sewing, who knew he could. Some leather and metal together in a new glove. Selfie was yawning and still looking out of the window though the scenery hadn't changed since the sun went down.
We can sleep anywhere, he insisted. Furthermore, I need to discuss watch schedules with you. Watch schedules?
She repeated, surprised. He nodded once.
Yes. I'm confident the 3 of us can handle the watch so the rest of you can sleep. I've already assigned shifts but if you want to change them, I want to hear so. Wait,
Rinoa held up her hands, stopping him.
Why do we need watch schedules? To keep an eye for Galbadian military. And why would they come out here? They're searching for a train car. The train graveyard is the first place I would look. Yeah, but the G Army is full of incompetent idiots. We both know that. They're drafted into service, none of them care about their jobs. All the same. Seeds don't take risks like that. You don't need to worry about anything. I've already got it covered. We can handle watch duty.
Squall was actually wondering why she was fighting him about this.
But, won't you get less sleep?
She frowned.
I normally get 5 hours of sleep at night. Splitting the shift between the three of us will enable me to meet that satisfactorily.
Rinoa blinked at him, as though startled at his response. She peeked, but neither Zell nor Selfie seemed the least bit affected by his decision.
I'll take first watch,
Squall said to his team and Rinoa.
Zell, you've got second. Selfie, third. What?
Zell looked up, dismayed.
Why do I have to have middle shift? Because you got dibs on the blue guard,
Squall returned calmly. Selfie laughed at Zell.
You should both get to sleep now. Zell, I'll wake you up in a few hours. Yeah,
he grumbled, walking towards the tech room. Selfie was right behind him. Rinoa almost didn't believe they would be sleeping in there, but they turned into the room. Curious as to how they were sleeping, she walked up the aisle and peered inside. Tiny Selfie was curled into a ball on the thinly cushioned two-person seat. Zell was in the computer chair, leaning back against the wall. Both of their eyes were already closed, their breathing evening, obeying their leader's order. It was not a room that Rinoa would have imagined being able to sleep in, but both appeared like they were not only trying, but beginning to succeed. She stepped back and looked over to the front where she had left Squall. She saw his boots disappear through the hatch onto the top of the train before it shut behind him. He really was about to take watch. Rinoa couldn't help it, she followed him up the ladder. She lifted up the hatch and looked around to see him turning back, surprised to see her coming up.
Did you need something?
He asked calmly. Rinoa hesitated only a second before stepping out all the way. She closed the hatch gently behind her. He had brought up his sword. He had actually come up here armed. Like he might seriously expect someone to come looking for them all the way out here. They could barely even see the lights of the actual town from the roof of the train. Rinoa didn't answer his question immediately. She walked across the train and sat down beside him on the edge. He watched her with carefully guarded eyes. It was almost like the moment when she had asked him to dance. He was closed off inside himself.
How's your hand?
She finally asked softly. He seemed surprised by the change in topic. He lifted his right hand and shrugged as he looked it over with the glove still on.
It's fine. Let me see. No. Why? I want to see,
she insisted, grabbing his wrist. It wasn't like the dance, he didn't let her pull him along this time. He jerked his wrist away before her fingers could get a proper grip on him.
I already cast a cure spell. It's healing just fine.
At the mention of the cure spell, Rinoa's eyes looked up at him again. And he carefully made sure that not a single muscle on his face betrayed that punch to the gut he felt yet again at seeing the way the moon and stars lit up those eyes.
I was really impressed,
she started softly.
The way you fought today. So quick and efficient. I can't even imagine trying to take on a monster like that by myself. You have a weapon, don't you? Well, yeah.
She looked at her wrist where the blaster edge waited, folded and dormant.
But I can't fight monsters with it. It's mostly just for thugs on the streets who can't take no for an answer.
Squall's brow furrowed slightly.
Does that happen often?
She shrugged.
I bought the weapon, didn't I?
When she looked back, his face was impassive again. She smiled at him.
But I'm nothing like you. It was like watching a real military captain. Even against an enemy you didn't know, you knew how to take it down. And your magic? Seeds really are good.
He said nothing for a moment.
Thank you.
She laughed softly.
So, who's Shiva? What? Shiva. You said her name during the fight. Shiva is my GF. Ifrit is Cells. Selfies is Siren. Oh,
she drew out the sound.
I heard that Seed knew the secrets for junctioning guardians, but I guess I never really believed it was true. They say it's dangerous. I've never had a problem before.
What was she doing out here? Surely, she didn't come up here just to ramble on about whatever topic.
And it's not really a secret. Anyone could do it. It's all a matter of finding or conquering a GF that doesn't mind sharing your head. It's a very personal sort of bond. Most don't like having someone sharing their thoughts. However, the power trade is worth it. I'm much stronger with Shiva than I would be without her. Anyone could do it, hey.
She repeated, kicking her feet against the train.
Even. Say, me. Of course,
he nodded, wondering where she was going with this. She suddenly turned and beamed at him.
Thank you. For what?
Rinoa laughed, shaking her head a bit. It was hard to explain how nice it was to hear someone say that she could learn to do something like junction a GF. Just not hearing someone tell her no flat out to a thing like this was refreshing.
So, can you? Can I what? Teach me how to junction a GF,
she laughed.
I find myself curious after that battle. Do you have a GF to junction? Well. No. Then, no.
He raised an eyebrow at her.
I can't teach you junctioning GF if you don't have one to junction. And I don't tend to keep spare GF in my... What?
He shook his head.
Nothing. I can't lend you Shiva even just to train. She's very possessive. And she says no anyway. She doesn't like new people. Is she talking right now?
Rinoa asked, her eyes lighting up eagerly.
I wouldn't describe it as talking,
Squall frowned.
It's more like a feeling. So, if I could get a GF, would you teach me?
He shrugged.
Sure.
He saw no reason not to. Junctioning GF was hardly a secret. It was simply a skill that Seed used while most people did not. And Rinoa was his boss. If she was telling him to teach her how to fight, he couldn't say no. It was actually a very practical sort of thing to learn. He found himself impressed that she wanted to.
Thanks, Squall. And, I'm sorry again about your hand. Don't be. I'm not. You should get to sleep.
Rinoa gave him a small smile.
I could tell you the same thing. You know you're wasting your time up here, right? Yeah. But would you be willing to bet your life on it?
She hesitated.
Okay, you make a fair point. Good night, Squall. Good night,
he replied. He heard her walking behind him and open the hatch. He heard her hesitate then and felt her eyes on his back. Somehow, it didn't bother him to feel Rinoa watching him as it did Quistis. Then she was gone. A few hours later, Squall came down to wake Zell up. Groggy and complaining, he took up Squall's position on the rooftop. Even then, Squall didn't go to sleep. He hesitated in the tech room before walking outside the train, opposite the side Zell could see. He walked around one of the old train carcasses. He pulled out his inventory and pressed a few buttons on it. He pointed and clicked and, just like that, the black oil lamp that Headmaster Sid had given him was laid out on the ground. He bent over it and stared at the pure white wick. It wasn't a hesitation. It was simple curiosity. He was wondering if the wax would light immediately or if he needed to burn it down like an ordinary candle. A small lighter came out of his inventory next and he lit it up. The tiny light was bright in the darkness as he held it up to the wick of the candle. It caught immediately. The flame burned on the wax for just a moment. Then, as the wax burned away and the wick caught, the flame turned black. With a wink of red light, Squall was gone and the only thing left was the oil lamp burning a black flame that cast shadows instead of light.
Wake up, Squall! Watts is back!
Renoa's call had his eyes snapping open, consciousness returning to him immediately. If Renoa saw his hand automatically reaching for his gun blade, she didn't mention it. He pushed himself up in the computer chair as Renoa ran from the room with Zell. Squall winced and grabbed for his ribs. He was starting to suspect that he had more than just earned a few bruises last night. He might even have cracked his ribs altogether. Trying to take deep breaths through the pain, Squall stood and walked down towards the debriefing room where the others had gone. Shiva was already releasing more cure spells into his body, he was nearly out of them at this point. All the while, she was chastising him for being so foolhardy last night after a long day of fighting in the first place. He was rubbing his head, cursing the weird nightmares he had endured last night. Which was common when you fell asleep without unjunctioning a GF. However, he had wanted her at hand immediately in case his aching ribs woke him up. Which they had. Twice. Removing the pain from his face, Squall walked into the debriefing room where the others were all already waiting. Renoa was smiling at him, oblivious to anything. However, both Zell and Selfie were used to how each of them moved at this point and noted the new stiffness. Their faces pinched in concerned, but neither of them said anything as Squall turned to Watts.
So?
Renoa asked, now that everyone was here.
Info, sir. New info. It's big news.
The breathless Watts yelled happily.
I found out the real president did in fact come to Timber, sir, in a convoy in secret last night. And I found out why he's here. The president's going to the old TV station. Security super tight, sir.
Renoa frowned, cocking her head curiously.
The TV station? Why in Timber? They have a TV station in Galbadia. It's state-of-the-art. They can broadcast easier from there than they could here. Hey,
Selfie leaned up towards Squall.
Do you think this has to do with that communication tower thing they took over? What's that?
Zone asked, looking to her. Squall had no reason not to tell them. It wasn't classified information. So he spoke calmly.
Dalit has a communication tower from the old days that can transmit and receive radio waves through a dish. It's been abandoned since radio waves stopped traveling reliably, but the Galbadian army got it up and running a few days ago. Oh.
Realization lit up Zone's face.
I get it. The only TV station in the world that can handle broadcasts over the air is this one here in Timber. It was never upgraded after the war because Galbadia took over our broadcasting systems and has refused to let us broadcast our own channels. So when everyone else switched to HD cables after waves stopped working, Timber TV didn't. It will be the only place that can transmit radio waves anymore.
So, what's that supposed to mean? Rinoa asked.
It must mean that they're planning on using radio waves to transmit something over the air. It's the only way they can do so without cable lines. I mean, they could if they had figured out a way to make radio waves work again. And why go through this trouble if they didn't? I know that,
Rinoa said, stomping her foot.
What I want to know is what the president is going to broadcast. And why use radio waves? They wouldn't be limited by networks like the cables would,
Zone suggested, shrugging.
Nor would the video need to be pre-recorded. So they could broadcast to everyone.
She guessed.
What could the president possibly want to say to the entire world?
Selfie had an answer. That she yelled loudly and with a great deal of enthusiasm.
Everybody! Love! And peace! No,
Zone frowned as Zell and Rinoa shook their heads at her.
If it's important enough for the president himself to speak after 17 years of silence, it must be big.
It's been that long?
Rinoa said in awe. That's incredible. Hey! Wouldn't it be wonderful if the first broadcast could be the declaration of Timber's independence? Hey! Yeah!
Zone caught on to her excitement easily.
That might be possible.
She nodded quickly.
Let's come up with a plan then.
Squall wasn't sure what he expected. He definitely did not expect Zone and Watts to crouch down by the crate in the corner. Rinoa smiled at the three seeds.
Can you guys give us a minute?
Then she plopped right down with them. Their voices were hushed as they talked quickly. Squall, Zell, and Selfie were sharing looks over the action.
Are they serious?
Zell whispered.
They call that a strategy meeting. When can we go home, Squall?
Selfie asked, frowning.
Were we just here for this one mission? Hey, yeah,
Zell frowned.
We don't even actually know how long we're stationed here. I'll find out,
Squall said, looking back towards where the three owls were talking quickly, smiling and nodding as they cracked another harebrained scheme. If it was anything like the one that had him dangling from a moving train, he should probably be very afraid. His ribs were in no condition to handle that right now. He walked over and, as he approached, Rinoa beamed up at him.
Good timing. We've come up with a plan.
Just like that? They hadn't even been talking for a full minute. What could they possibly have come up with? Even just a basic storm the castle type of strategy should take more than 30 seconds to figure out.
Before we get into that,
Squall said, kneeling and biting back a moan of pain from the way it made his ribs complain.
Can I see your contract with our garden? Oh, sure.
The contract was inside the crate/strategy meeting table. She pulled it out and passed it off to him. He was already starting to read it when he felt Zell and Selfie came look over his shoulder.
What's it say?
Zell asked. He moved his eyes up to them, then back to the top of the paper and read off in monotone.
Balam Garden, hereafter referred to as Party A, acknowledges the Forest Owls, hereafter referred to as Party B, as the hiring party. Seed, hereafter referred to as Party C, shall be dispatched upon signing of this contract. Party C shall operate under. The hell?
Zell interrupted, reeling back slightly.
I don't get it,
Selfie agreed, making a face.
Oh, yeah.
Rinoa laughed at their reactions, taking back the contract quickly.
That one's pretty confusing. When I told him I didn't understand, Sid gave me a different one.
She pulled another piece of paper, shorter this time, from the crate. She passed it off to Squall with a wide smile.
Sid is such a nice man. What's his say this time?
Selfie asked, leaning back over him. Squall had to turn it around, she had given it to him backwards. Then he read off calmly.
To the Forest Owls, this seed deployment contract will last until Timber achieves independence. Please make good use of each seed member. I wish you the best with your objective. Please understand that this contract is an exception and no replacement of seed members can be made. Signed, Balam Garden Headmaster, Sid Kramer.
Rinoa was watching them as Squall read. She expected them to be irritated at the replacement comment, like people were tools that could be traded in if one broke. They latched onto a completely different comment.
Until Timber's independence.
Zell jumped, surprised.
That is so vague.
Selfie agreed, distraught.
Hey, you're paid professionals.
Rinoa frowned at them, standing and putting her hands on her hips to glare.
No complaining.
Squall stood as well, fighting back a flinch of pain. Yeah, his ribs were definitely broken. A cure spell would have healed even bone bruises by this point. He needed stronger healing magic unless he wanted these bones to heal the old-fashioned way.
Squall.
Selfie frowned at the way he moved. Rinoa and the other owls might not have been able to see the stiffness, but the seeds could.
It's fine,
he said, passing back the letter. Rinoa didn't understand they were talking about something else and nodded.
Of course it is. So, on to our plan. We're going to the TV station. Zone, Watts.
Even the seeds who hadn't known them as well as Rinoa did knew exactly what both men were going to do, even as she was beginning to turn to ask them.
Gathering information is my specialty, sir. Ow, my stomach.
She made a face, groaning at their actions.
Okay, then, so just the four of us.
There she was with that us thing again. Still, it was probably better not to travel in big groups. Especially not since the Galbadian military would now be looking for big groups.
Zell, Selfie,
Squall turned to his squad.
We'll take separate routes to the station. I'll go with Rinoa. Can the two of you make it on your own? Naturally.
Zell said, pounding his chest.
Are you going to be okay?
Selfie frowned at his chest.
Won't that wound keep you from being able to fight? Wound.
Rinoa looked back at them as Zone and Watts left the room.
You mean your hand? I thought you told me it was going to be fine. My hand is fine,
he assured her.
And I'm fine as well, Selfie. I have some potions with me if I need to take them. Man, those are pretty much just painkillers.
Zell frowned at him.
How about this, you take Selfie and Rinoa to the station, and I'll go try to hunt down something that will actually work. Selfie can fight at your back so you don't strain yourself. Yeah.
Selfie agreed.
What are you guys talking about?
Rinoa asked, frowning between them. Squall couldn't deny that would probably be a relief.
All right. But switch out. Selfie, you go find something. Zell, you stay with me. What? Why? You don't trust me?
To be professional and reliable out of his sight? Not a bit.
You're the better fighter, Zell. With this injury, I won't be able to fight at full capacity, so I need someone I know can fight. Selfie is faster than you are, too. She'll be able to move quicker. And we both know how single-minded she is, and how distracted you can be. Man, why you gotta bring logic into it?
Zell frowned as Selfie laughed.
Will someone tell me what you're talking about?
Rinoa asked, pushing herself into their conversation.
Squall, what wound?
As she asked, she reached out to touch him. Her hand hit against his side. His injured side, and Squall let out a hiss of air at the pain. She jerked back quickly.
Wah! Squall, what's that? You didn't have that last night. He went into the lamp without inviting us,
Zell said, crossing his arms at him.
I had to practically drag him back inside when he came out again. He's lucky he didn't die. Yeah,
Selfie agreed, frowning at their leader as well.
Seed rule number 1, never fight alone. It's already done with, and I didn't even close to die,
he told them calmly.
Stop over-dramatizing. It's a couple of broken ribs at most. I've had worse. Wait, Lamp. Your ribs?
Squall. Rinoa shook her head, trying to understand as the train started up and began driving again.
What are you talking about?
Squall turned back to her. He blinked at her once before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a single Odine capsule. The glowing ring told her that something was inside it. She looked up as he held it out to her. She only took it because she didn't want him lifting his arms too long and straining any broken bones.
What is it?
She asked, frowning at the capsule. She was used to these. They were everywhere in the Galbadian army. They were what enabled them to use magic without GFs when junctioned into the proper machines.
You said you wanted to learn,
Squall said carelessly, like it didn't even matter.
Learn? Wah!
Rinoa froze as she realized what he was talking about.
Wait a minute. Are you telling me there's a GF inside this thing? His name is Diablos,
Squall said calmly.
I conquered him last night inside the lamp he had been imprisoned within. He put up a good fight. That's all.
Rinoa's eyes were wide and guilty as she looked between him and the capsule.
But, you said. And I thought that. Squall, you didn't get this just for me, did you? You said you wanted to learn,
he repeated as though that were reason enough for having fractured his ribs.
So did you or not?
She could hardly say no to him now. Racked with guilt, she turned the capsule in her suddenly numb fingers.
So, how do I use it? Press that release switch there and let his energy fall into you. He'll do that part himself, you don't have to worry about it.
Zell and Selfie had seen GF junctioning before. This was like the rehash of an old primary school lesson to them, and they were completely uninterested. So they walked from the room, discussing likely locations for finding high-strength cure spells or items. Rinoa licked her lips before flicking open the release on the capsule. As he promised, the energy that billowed forth and dropped down into her arm acted on its own. She didn't need to do anything. But she did let out a wordless sound of surprise at the sensation. It felt like her limb got suddenly heavier as the energy languidly traveled up. It moved on its own, an alien mind, from her limb through her neck then up into her brain. The heaviness came with it, and she suddenly felt like there was a weight pressing down just under the crown of her head. She couldn't help it, she reached up to touch the spot, making a face. As the heaviness settled, she suddenly felt a sense of curiosity that wasn't hers. Like someone had broken into her mind, she felt suddenly and completely invaded. She actually jumped, crying out to feel whatever it was reaching through her brain like it had a right to.
Make it stop!
She yelled, dropping the capsule and grabbing her head.
Make it hold still! I can't,
Squall said, watching her calmly.
You have to. He's in your head. I know it feels strange, but don't forget that it is your head. He's only a guest so long as you let him be. You have to exercise control yourself or he'll do whatever he wants.
What had Squall said his name was? Dio something? No, Diablos.
Diablos, stop!
She ordered, shaking now. Only the knowledge that Squall was in pain from broken bones kept her from demanding he remove the thing now. There was no way she could give up just like that after he had hurt himself to obtain a GF for her. The guilt she was feeling caught the GF's attention more than her command did. He recognized her guilt, knew where it was coming from. He found it funny.
It is not funny,
she snapped, stomping her foot. Did she just stomp her foot? Was she a child? Was that who Master Squall thought the great Diablos was supposed to serve? A child?
I am not a child,
Rinoa growled dangerously.
And I swear if you call me that again, I'm putting you back in that capsule and I'm dropping it in the ocean.
It wasn't just a threat. It was a sincere promise. He could feel the truth of it in her emotions. And instead of being threatened or upset, he was actually impressed. He hadn't expected something so devious from a girl who would stomp her foot. She had basically just threatened to throw him away in the dark, cold, crushing ocean for eternity with no way of escape. Only someone who had some darkness inside could make such a threat.
I am not a child,
Rinoa repeated more calmly.
I am sorry for that though. I just don't think you laughing at Squall's pain is very nice.
Meh, he asked for it. He had started the fight. He knew what was going to happen when he lit the oil lamp. Besides, he had given just as good as he got. She should be praising the warrior for his skill, not pitying the badges of honor he wore.
Badges of honor?
She repeated incredulously.
Ugh, men.
Diablos was laughing at her now, but he didn't question her. He also stopped reaching through her mind like he had a right to. Rinoa's eyes focused back on reality and she realized that she had just been having an argument with something no one could see or hear. She laughed, embarrassed.
Tell me that wasn't as lame as it looked. I had very nearly the same conversation with Shiva the first time,
Squall shrugged. She remembered that he would be used to people talking to their GF. It wasn't lame to him at all.
Are you feeling okay with that?
Rinoa paused, thinking over the feeling of Diablos in her head. It was a strange weight, but it wasn't a painful one. It was like the sensation of doing anything new. It was just different. It would take experience to become accustomed to it.
It's not bad,
she finally admitted, smiling.
And you're right. That was easy. Do you have any magic stocked? No, not really. Then you can take some of mine. What?
Rinoa blinked in surprise as he brought out his inventory.
No, Squall. I can't take your spells. That's too much. I don't use this magic. I just have it. It's useless to me. Ask Diablos what affinity he prefers. But, Squall,
she frowned as Diablos provided an answer.
He says time and space magic, but he'll deal with status affects. Squall, I can't take your magic. Shiva is picky. She won't let me have any heat-based magic. So you can have my old fire spells. They're still good though. I have a couple demos that I traded for. Sleep, from the Grats. Confuse, Berserk, Bio, Silence. Those were pretty hard to get. Whatever. Shiva says absolutely not. Squall, that's way too much. No, not really. I have too many sleeps anyway. Grats are really good for those. Besides, these are just some basic spells. Except maybe the Bio, but it's another one Shiva won't use. I won't miss it.
When he put his inventory away, he had a small handful of the capsules. He held them out for her and again she took them just to avoid straining his ribs.
Squall. AGF is just decoration if you don't give it magic. That's what gives it true power.
Rinoa made another sound of protest as she looked at the capsules.
What am I supposed to do with these? You? Nothing. You can't. Give them to Diablos. He will control the magic for you. You'll need to call on him to cast spells. So, really, another very easy thing to do. Diablos can definitely handle the magic load.
Diablos agreed regally, but Rinoa still felt hot guilt. She didn't realize that when she had made that almost offhand comment last night about learning how to junction that Squall would actually start the process needed to teach her. Who took someone that seriously? But he had taken her that seriously. He had hurt himself in the process. She ignored Diablos telling her that he had hurt Squall, not himself. She pressed the release button on the capsules and let the spells fall into her arm. No, Diablos reached out and captured them, pulling them in. He greedily sucked in each one until Rinoa was left with a handful of empty capsules. Squall nodded and took them from her to place back in his inventory. He started explaining to her how each one could potentially be used to assist her in battle, including a technique involving placing the spells on her weapon so that she would infect people with them as she hit them. Something she never would have thought of doing on her own, but, apparently, Seed did all the time. She paid very close attention. The Galbadian commander in charge of Timber frowned at the latest report to reach his ears.
A guy dressed as a cadet gathering information. Yes, sir,
the cadet reported, saluting him.
He was asking about the president's stay. I found it strange that a cadet would keep asking about the president when he should have already been debriefed. He was very polite and kept addressing me as sir.
The captain next to the commander jumped.
Wait, I think I know who you're talking about. I saw him taking care of 3 suspicious-looking characters from VIII. Well, only one was suspicious-looking. I'll go question every teenager in the area. No. We can't just go up to anybody and...
It was too late. The captain was already running off. The commander cleared his throat to continue to the cadet.
These are citizens. We can't inflict any. How dare they try to kidnap the president?
The cadet yelled, enraged.
Not only is it disrespectful to the president, but also to us Galbadian soldiers as well. I'll be sure to find them and throw their sad behinds in jail.
He ran off as well, grabbing another cadet so they could look together. The commander let out a long sigh. He was the only high-class soldier in the entire Galbadian army that didn't dock pay as punishment. He was the commander with most loyalty in ranks. He disciplined his men properly and did his best to try to make them get along with the occupied timber residents, as well as make sure the timber residents weren't overly encumbered by the Galbadian army. So he was proud, in a way, that his men felt such loyalty to their president when he knew that didn't hold true across the entire army. But still.
Please. Hear me out. To the very end.
He sighed down at the silent train station below him. Squall was finishing his lesson as the train came to a halt at one of the stations in town. So Rinoa led Squall to the exit and stared in wonder at how he didn't walk like he had broken his ribs. At least not according to her inexpert eye. Watts was already at the door, seeing Selfie and Zell out onto the platform. He was speaking as the two of them came out of the debriefing room.
The TV station is quite close if you take the local train. Oh, but the trains have stopped running, sir. So you'll have to find another way there.
Squall stepped out of the train and turned as Rinoa stepped down as well. Watts stepped out after them, frowning as he thought of something.
I think there's an old back entrance to the TV station behind the Timber Maniacs building. You know, the magazine? I don't know that it will help, but it's worth a try, sir.
Watts? Zone yelled from inside the train.
Come on. The Galbadian soldiers just spotted us. There are lots of guards patrolling the city now, sir,
Watts told them as the train started up its engine again.
Please be careful, sir. They're probably searching for us. Hey, Watts,
Selfie smiled.
You know lots of stuff, right? I do my best, sir.
He blushed, pleased.
Do you know where I can find some good healing magic? I know the store has potions, but I'm looking for something with a little more oomph. You know.
Watts put his hand to his chin, thinking. The train started moving behind him. Squall could see soldiers pointing and running after it.
I heard there's something called the Owl's Tear somewhere in the city and that can do wonder on injuries, sir. I don't know exactly where it is, but they say that an old man guards it. Whatever that means, sir.
As he was talking, the train was pulling out from behind him. Watts didn't even notice until he looked over and saw it starting to turn around the bend.
Hey! Don't leave me, sir. RRR.
Then Squall watched with a raised eyebrow as he jumped onto the tracks and started sprinting after the departing train.
I'll give him points for tenacity,
he said softly as Rinoa and Selfie laughed and Zell shook his head.
I'm off then,
Selfie beamed before jumping off the platform and running away. Rinoa frowned.
Why didn't she just take the stairs? They're right there. You know,
Zell sighed,
if you can answer that question, you'll solve a lot of mysteries.
End of chapter.